Well, everyone, good afternoon. On behalf of Fred Kemp, our president, and the entire Atlantic Council family, it's a great honor and privilege to welcome everybody out to this afternoon's session. One that is dedicated or focused on countering propaganda and Disinformation Act. And no, it doesn't have anything to do with this year's presidential campaign. I'd like in particular to extend a special welcome to the bill's two co-sponsors and our keynote speakers, Senators Rob Portman and Chris Murphy. Thank you both for being here, for dedicating your time to this effort, and for choosing the Atlantic Council as a platform to review this important bill that really does embody more than anything else the bipartisan spirit that the Atlantic Council stands for. Before we begin, I'd like to note that today's event is on the record and being live streamed online. Please join the conversation using the hashtag #ACRussia and the Twitter handle #ACEurasia. Now, Russia's military interventions in eastern Ukraine and Syria continue to be a contentious topic of debate. Russia's ongoing methods of disinformation include manipulation tactics that use social media and various other outlets to distort the public perception of reality and advance Russian interests in the region. Here at the Atlantic Council, our Dinu Patriciu Eurasia Center, led by the great Ambassador John Herbst, has been firing on all cylinders to help battle Russia's disinformation. From the provocative Hiding in Plain Sight report we released just last year, which used innovative digital forensic methods to expose Russian military presence in Ukraine, to the numerous events we've hosted on the topic, we remain organizationally committed to moving the needle on this critical set of issues that are of immense geopolitical and strategic relevance. Through our work, we hope to continue toward a comprehensive U.S. strategy that both responds to and tackles disinformation while also promoting our shared values of prosperity, security, and freedom. The Countering Propaganda and Disinformation Act, which we're here to discuss, represents a huge breakthrough in U.S. legislation. Not only does it demonstrate a robust effort from the United States to counter Russian disinformation with a comprehensive and unified strategy, it also sends the message that the United States remains committed to helping its allies in Europe and contributing to a more stable and prosperous Europe. There are without doubt significant obstacles to formulating such a strategy. In just a few moments, we'll hear from Senators Portman and Murphy, who have been the key architects behind this bill. In addition to drilling down on these challenges, they'll also lay out their plans to overcome them. So without further ado, I'd like to turn over this podium to Senator Rob Portman, former U.S. Trade Representative, U.S. Senator from Ohio, and Chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. After Senator Portman's address, we'll turn straight to Senator Murphy to hear his perspective. We'll then move to our very special panel discussion with Kristen Lord, Jeffrey Gedman, and Steve Sestanovich, moderated by our very own John Herbst. Once again, thank you all for joining us. We hope that you enjoy today's event. Thank you all so very much. Senator.
John, thank you very much. It's always good to be with you, Governor, Ambassador. And he doesn't often talk about this, but he is not just a former ambassador to China, he is also a former U.S. Trade Ambassador. He was Deputy Ambassador, Deputy Trade Representative and Ambassador prior to my becoming U.S. Trade Representative.
You corrected all of our mistakes.
Yeah. So I went to him when I got the job and I said, "Am I crazy to do this, John?" He said, "Yes." But we did it anyway and made a lot of progress building on your foundation. So I want to thank you, thank Fred Kemp, thank the Atlantic Council for allowing us to come here today to talk about our legislation, but also, more importantly, for the work you're doing. And the Hiding in Plain Sight report is an example of that. We were just talking about how many Russian citizens downloaded that report. Was it 3 million? 3 million in 2 weeks. And so this is the kind of transparency and information that's extremely helpful. Not just in this debate we're going to have today about, what do you do on the propaganda and information front, but just in providing more transparency and information to have a more peaceful and stable world. And I do think we're here to talk about one of the most important challenges we face. It's also one of the least understood. And it's not understood as well by us in the States because, we are transparent. We provide the opportunity for people to get information from all different sources, and to a certain extent, this is not consistent with what we view as the role of a government. But what's facing the United States and our allies around the world is this issue. How do we counter the extensive propaganda, disinformation operations that are directed against us and our allies? I've seen it firsthand. I've been in the last couple of years to Poland, Latvia, Ukraine, and talked to officials and actually seen some of the information that's being used against their citizens and talked to them about their concerns about it. Senator Murphy and I are also very involved on these issues. We are co-founders of the Ukraine Caucus and have been talking to people about it. I was with the ambassador from Ukraine over the weekend in Ohio, where we had an opportunity to talk a little about what's going on the eastern border of Ukraine today. The legislation that we're introducing, we believe, overcomes some of the conceptual and structural barriers to addressing this issue effectively and marks the first step toward a more comprehensive U.S. strategy to counter propaganda and disinformation. I'll get into details in a second, but let me take a few minutes to discuss the nature of the threat as I see it and the obstacles we face in dealing with it. Friday, March 18th, this Friday marks the second anniversary of the annexation of Crimea by Russia. It seems like it was longer ago to me, partly because many people aren't even talking about it anymore. But it's only been 2 years. The subsequent military intervention in eastern Ukraine started around then. These events and the ongoing violence that still grips eastern Ukraine not only created an active military conflict, but also have exposed and intensified a broader struggle over the future of Central and Eastern Europe. I would say the future of NATO, and I would say of the rules-based, American-led international community. The modern information environment, from traditional media outlets to social media to grassroots campaigns, is ground zero in this debate. In my view, the United States is not doing enough to counter the destabilizing foreign propaganda and disinformation operations that dominate this space. While much of the public discussion of these issues is focused on the urgent need to counter extremist messaging, and I understand that, I think it's equally important to address the extremely sophisticated, comprehensive, and long-term efforts by nation-states to manipulate and control information in order to achieve their national objectives, often at the expense of U.S. allies, our interests, our values. These countries spend vast sums of money on advanced broadcast and digital media capabilities, targeted campaigns, funding of foreign political movements, and other efforts to influence key audiences and populations. China spends billions annually on its foreign propaganda efforts. RT, some of you know, Russia's state-funded 24/7 international news channel, reportedly spends about $400 million a year annually just on its Washington bureau here in D.C. Just one bureau. By contrast, the FY17 budget request for international broadcasting operations worldwide for the United States of America is only about $768 million total. That gives you some sense of where we are versus these other efforts. While much of the discussion on these issues has focused on Russia, and I understand why, Russia is not the only country that engages heavily in these efforts. We mentioned China earlier. Chinese land reclamation in the South China Sea is another recent example of how effective disinformation operations can be used to seize the initiative, and in this case, catch the United States and its allies off guard and unprepared. I believe treating this problem as a public affairs issue exclusively is a critical mistake and a key conceptual roadblock that we have to fight to overcome. It's not just that we aren't tweeting enough, although maybe we should tweet more. The concept is much broader than that. They don't merely deliver a message to an audience, rather they seek to actively shape perceptions by using all the tools of national power. To be sure, strategic communications and media engagement play a key role in information strategies, but they're just one set of tools among a broad array of information-related capabilities and activities, such as cyber and intelligence capabilities, traditional cultural and educational exchanges, economic engagement that are employed within a common strategic and operational framework. The most sophisticated media engagement strategies in the world will not work if the adversary jams communication towers, censors media outlets, or pursues a comprehensive strategy of grassroots manipulation designed to shape perceptions on the ground, as occurred in Crimea and continues to occur in eastern Ukraine and elsewhere. The purpose of these combined efforts is to motivate potential allies while confusing, delaying, and disrupting the target audience's decision-making process. Look, our democratic values here in the United States forbid us from engaging in the same deceptive and subversive techniques used by some other nations, and for good reason. These values are fundamental to our identity as a nation and a key source of our global appeal. We must always remember that. But disagreements over tactics should not obscure the effectiveness of a conceptual framework behind them, nor diminish the importance of drawing from this framework to develop a comprehensive, whole-of-government approach to countering them. Surprisingly, there's currently no single U.S. governmental agency or department charged with the national-level development, integration, and synchronization of whole-of-government strategies to counter foreign propaganda and disinformation. Current efforts to address this threat are hamstrung by bureaucratic inefficiencies, unclear authorities, a lack of accountability, and a lack of interagency communication and unity of effort. The State Department generally has led the effort for engaging and communicating with foreign audiences. However, since the end of the Cold War, and especially in this administration, the State Department has focused much less on political messaging designed to combat foreign propaganda, undermine anti-American ideologies, or promote U.S. values, preferring instead to conduct more traditional public affairs through the Bureau of Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. The one area where the administration has attempted to implement an interagency counterinformation war strategy, the administration's recently revamped initiative on countering violent extremists like ISIS, has struggled to make an impact. I believe this is in part because of the administration's unwillingness to acknowledge the radical Islamic ideology that motivates the extremists in the first place, but in any case, efforts to counter the more large-scale and extensive state-sponsored information operations against the United States and our allies continue to be neglected. In the absence of State Department-led initiatives to counter foreign propaganda and win the war of ideas, the task for political messaging has largely fallen to the Broadcasting Board of Governors, the independent federal agencies that oversees all civilian international media organizations, like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. These organizations have had some very effective programming and do effective work promoting free and healthy press. Some programs, like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty's Current Time program, have had demonstrable success in pushing back against foreign disinformation. However, the scale and scope of these efforts pales in comparison to those of the big 24-hour state-owned news outlets like RT, Russia Today, CCTV, China Central Television, and others. Even with more funding and resources, the success of U.S. foreign broadcasting would be hindered without a coordinated whole-of-government strategy. Despite states' role as the lead for engaging foreign audiences, the Department of Defense actually conducts most of the U.S. government's information operations. However, DoD's information operations tend to be more tactical in nature, understandably, and are tied to specific campaign or operational objectives developed within the regionally based combatant commands. By necessity, they're also more military in nature and are not always focused on the broader political or social themes in the way efforts by other agencies would be. What coordination exists within the State Department and between agencies is largely dictated, frankly, by the relationship between the combatant commander, whoever that happens to be, and the relevant ambassadors and assistant secretaries. In addition to the bureaucratic obstacles within the government, the U.S. government is missing out on important opportunities to leverage the significant expertise outside of the U.S. government. Think tanks, NGOs, civil society, other organizations, private sector companies, particularly those that operate in the frontline nations, such as Ukraine, the Baltics, Japan, have a tremendous amount of experience dealing with foreign propaganda and disinformation. They could offer valuable insights to help us to analyze and counter these efforts. We would be foolish not to use these valuable resources. I think this is the challenge that we face. Structural deficiencies are preventing us from effectively countering foreign disinformation and propaganda and will continue to hinder future administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, unless they are addressed. To overcome these obstacles and promote a more comprehensive, proactive approach to winning the war of ideas, Senator Murphy and I are introducing the Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act. To be clear, our legislation is not designed to permanently single out any one nation or nations for special attention. Just because the disinformation campaigns from countries like Russia or China may be a problem today does not mean these challenges won't evolve over time. This is a broader effort. As the nature of the threat evolves, so too should our efforts. Our legislation is organized around three main priorities to achieve this goal. The first priority is developing a whole-of-government strategy for countering foreign propaganda and disinformation. The bill would establish the Center for Information Analysis and Response, led by the State Department, but with the active participation of the Department of Defense, USAID, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, the intelligence community, and other relevant agencies. The Center will develop, integrate, and synchronize whole-of-government initiatives to expose and counter foreign disinformation operations and proactively advance fact-based narratives that support U.S. allies and interests. Second, our legislation seeks to leverage expertise from outside government to create more adaptive and responsive U.S. strategy options. Our legislation establishes a fund to help train local journalists and provides grants and contracts to NGOs, civil society organizations, think tanks, private sector companies, media organizations, and other experts outside the U.S. government, but with experience in identifying and analyzing the latest trends in foreign government disinformation campaigns. This fund will complement and support the Center's role by integrating capabilities and expertise available outside the U.S. government into the strategy-making process. It will also empower a decentralized network of private sector experts in integrating their expertise into the strategy-making process. Finally, our legislation works to empower local communities to resist foreign manipulation through increased cultural and educational exchanges. The bill provides for special consideration to students and community leaders applying to State Department exchange programs from populations and countries heavily targeted by foreign disinformation and propaganda campaigns. As we've seen in Ukraine and elsewhere, one of the best ways to push back against destabilization and disinformation is at the grassroots level. I firmly believe that the American people are our country's most effective ambassadors, and these exchange programs have a proven track record of building long-term relationships between Americans and foreign individuals and communities. So much of foreign propaganda preys on the fears and misconceptions people have about America. Believe me, if you're going to come to the United States of America, come to my state of Ohio, you'll be a lot less likely to think the United States is part of some plot to ruin your community. I met with a group of young people today from the State Department's Future Leaders Exchange Program called the FLEX program. Some of you are aware of it. These were exchange students from Georgia and Kazakhstan. This is just coincidental. They happen to be in town today. And I talked to them about this. They're living with host families in my home state of Ohio. And folks, they love Ohio, and they love America, and they've seen it firsthand. America's democratic values and open, transparent society are a key source of our identity as a nation, and one of our greatest advantages against the propaganda and disinformation used to discredit them. I'm confident that in the long run, America has the better story to tell, and the disinformation and propaganda used against our allies and our interests will fail. After all, we're a nation defined by our shared ideals, not by a particular ethnicity or religion that even today attracts people from around the world. We don't need to lie to be able to sell ourselves to others. But the truth will not simply prevail on its own. We must be more effective in ensuring it prevails. Our legislation is the first step toward a more comprehensive strategy of action to counter those who seek to manipulate, misinform, and destabilize our friends around the world. The disinformation threat cannot be measured simply by land, by lives, or by money, but it is no less urgent. Confronting it will require American leadership. This bill is the first step toward removing the barrier standing in the way of America reassuming its leadership role. This is a fight we cannot afford to lose. And with that, as Governor Huntsman has said, my colleague is here, and I'd like for him to share some words with you as well. The junior senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy. He is, as I said, co-founder of our bipartisan Ukraine caucus. Perhaps most importantly, he has chaired the Foreign Relations Committee subcommittee on Europe and Eurasia, and he's been a real leader on this issue. And he understands the need to have a more comprehensive approach to foreign policy generally and our national security. I'm very pleased to have partnered with him on this legislation. He's informed, he's thoughtful, he's the kind of member who you want to work with, and also it's nice to have a little bipartisan effort here to show that even in Washington, there are areas where both sides can work together to achieve meaningful results. Senator Murphy.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Portman. It has been really wonderful and meaningful to work with you on this legislation. I want to add my thanks to both the Governor and to Fred and to the entire team here at the Atlantic Council. I've had the benefit of being able to work with many of you over my period of rapid education as a new member of the Senate and new member of the Foreign Relations Committee. And I want to especially add a word of thanks to those of Senator Portman with respect to the work that you've done on the crisis in Ukraine. As some of you know, I had the fortune or the misfortune, however you see it, of traveling to Ukraine in 2013 and 14 with Senator McCain. We happened to be there 3 different occasions, which was once on probably the day of the biggest demonstrations on the Maidan, a Sunday in which both Senator McCain and I spoke to the crowd assembled. Then later on the day of the so-called referendum, the sham referendum on the future of Crimea. And then the third time, a celebratory moment when we returned for the inauguration of President Poroshenko and the work that you have done to expose the propaganda campaign in Ukraine of the Russians, to tell the true story of this revolution of dignity, as the Ukrainians will tell it, has been meaningful and impactful. And I think our work on this broader anti-propaganda measure comes from our common bond, Senator Portman and I, around a future in Ukraine that leaves a free and sovereign and independent nation. And at the heart of this debate really is that question of sovereignty. I happen to be reading a wonderful book right now entitled Lawrence in Arabia, and it's a sort of survey of the military campaigns that T. Lawrence was a part of in the Middle East during World War I. And it tells the story of the maneuverings of the then colonial powers happening at the same moment as the introduction of a brand new concept to the world of international relations, a moment at which Woodrow Wilson was suggesting that as a condition of U.S. entrance into the war, that our European partners start thinking about a phrase called self-determination. The idea that a nation should be able to decide for themselves as to their future, instead of countries deciding for them as to what their path would be. And I like to think that at the heart of what we're talking about today is a reinvestment in that concept of self-determination. Countering propaganda, whether it come from Russia or China or other sources, isn't about trying to substitute ideas coming from Moscow about the direction of a nation with ideas coming from Washington for the direction of a nation. It's to make sure that the information is available for people abroad to make decisions for themselves about their own lives and about their own futures. Russia is seeking today, and I'll talk about Russia because I think that's the avenue through which we come to this piece of legislation. Russia is seeking today to usher in a new type of quiet colonialism. They dominate information narratives such that a nation slowly loses its ability to see both sides of a story, loses its ability to decide its own path for itself. We see this maybe most apparently in Ukraine, but I want to talk for a second about an example, one of a myriad of less well-known issues of Russian propaganda having an effect locally. In October of 2014, I had the chance to spend a few days in Belgrade. I happened to be there on a fairly momentous day, a day in which Vladimir Putin happened to be paying a visit to Belgrade, marching through the streets of that city with an impressive parade of military hardware, capping off a day of meetings with President Vučić and others in the Serbian government. As you walk down the streets of Belgrade, you couldn't miss all of the billboards in which the Russian and Serbian flags were intertwined. And if you looked closely, you could see at the bottom that those billboards were paid for by Gazprom. As we did meetings throughout the day, we heard stories about, in the lead up to this visit by Putin, more and more money quietly coming from Russia flowing into more and more Serbian NGOs, finding its way to more and more supposedly independent media outlets. At the same time, I was sitting down with our U.S. ambassador, Michael Kirby, in that country, who was grappling with the pullout of USAID from Serbia at a moment where Russia was throwing in millions upon millions of new money, information warfare, economic and military support. And he was begging for a few extra $1 million just to keep alive a cultural and educational exchange program that he thought would be vital to help educate a new generation of Serbian leaders about the importance of transatlantic connections and alliances, a cultural exchange program that would hopefully be funded by virtue of the bill that we're introducing. Since then, the story hasn't gotten much better inside Serbia. Just last year, as a condition of the IMF bailout, the Serbians were forced to close down their main national news network. Guess what? Earlier that year, the Russians had opened up a branch of the Sputnik news agency, and now it is poised to potentially become the dominant news narrative inside Serbia. Once again, an example of Russia playing a very different game than the U.S. and many of our allies. By the way, that news agency inside Serbia, just in the last several months, have run stories entitled, "The Balkans Are Unstable by Intention," a long expose on how the West and the United States are intentionally trying to undermine the Western Balkans. A piece talking about how, with Western support, Kosovar Albanians are planning to run programs against Kosovar Serbs. And another piece discussing the Western plot to topple Miroslav Dodik, the leader of the Republic of Srpska, and replace that government with a Muslim-led coalition shortly after Christmas of this year. This is just the tip of the iceberg in one small country that doesn't get a lot of play here in the United States. But Serbia right now is deciding about whether they are going to join the European Union. They are having a conversation about the future of that nation. Russia has decided to make a major play to influence that conversation with a massive investment in information and propaganda. And the United States and many of our allies are either sitting on the sidelines or, with respect to the IMF's decision to force the closure of this Serbian news agency, actually playing a contrarian role. And so that brings us to our legislation. I think that our willingness, America's unwillingness to build an effective counter-propaganda effort has been largely willful. It's willful because this is a difficult subject for us to talk about. We have no interest in using U.S. funds to promote our own propaganda. But what we need to realize is that people around the world just need to have access to both sides of every story, to be able to at least hear two narratives in order to make a decision. And we hope that the legislation that we've introduced, and I won't go over the details because I think Senator Portman has covered it very well, will allow us to start having a positive effect in the best traditions of America's support for self-determination. The fact is that our willful ignorance of this problem has been manifested in the siloed nature of our counter-propaganda campaigns. And the simple suggestion in our bill is to have an umbrella strategy that unites all of the different agencies that are playing roles so that we can have a coordinated strategy. Senator Portman talked about this Information Access Fund. Will simply seek to seed good information efforts, telling the truth, telling counter-narratives to the Russian story, to the Chinese propaganda stories all around the world. And third, we'll try to beef up support for these exchange programs, which have been so vital to the growing move towards self-determination all around the world. There's a lot of talk about this term asymmetrical warfare these days, that other countries are playing with different influencers, different tools than the U.S. is. And I think that in the context of that conversation, it's important to note that we aren't trying to achieve symmetry. We aren't trying to grow tools proffered or funded by the United States that are co-equal to those being used by a country like Russia or a country like China. We aren't going to engage in willful propaganda. We cannot use our newfound energy bounty in order to bully other nations. We aren't going to engage in bribery and graft and outright old-fashioned intimidation in the way that many of these nations do. But we at least have to acknowledge the asymmetry and have a coordinated strategy to respond appropriately, legally, morally, in the best traditions of the West and U.S. foreign policy. Our hope is that this legislation, at least with respect to the asymmetrical nature of the spread of propaganda, can point us in that direction. And I think Senator Portman is right. I think it's significant that this is bipartisan. We are hopeful that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, on which I sit, will still be open for business throughout this spring and this summer. We hope to be able to grow co-sponsors to our legislation, engage the community that's represented in this room, and hopefully bring this debate to fruition this year. Again, thank you very much to the Atlantic Council. I look forward to this great panel and working with you over the weeks and months to come.
Senator Smith, that was wonderful. And Senator Portman's presentation was also outstanding. I'd like to bring up our panel. My name is John Herbst. I'm the director of the Dinu Patrizio Eurasia Center. And we have a great group here. We have Kristen Lord, who's coming up first, and Steve Sestanovich, an old partner in crime, who taught me about those little screwdrivers you use to fix glasses, 1986, when I was his control officer in Moscow, and Jeff Gedman. I don't want to delay the conversation by speaking too much myself. You have their bios, they're distinguished speakers distinguished experts able to address this subject. I'd just like to make the point that the proposed legislation outlined by Senators Portman and Smith is extremely thoughtful, comprehensive, and deals with an absolutely pressing need. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kristen.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for having me here today. I thought I would start by focusing not on any particular country that motivated the legislation, but on focusing on the proposed legislation more generally, and the whole host of issues it intends to address over a much longer term. And to do that, what I'd like to do is focus first on a couple words of praise, because I think there are some aspects of the legislation that are very praiseworthy indeed. I'd like to offer a couple words of caution based on my experience working on this issue over the past decade or so, and then a couple of words, if I may, of advice. I haven't seen the actual legislation. I'm hoping that means it's still being drafted, and I'm hoping I can make a couple of suggestions for round 2 or 20 or whatever they're on at this point. So let me start with the praise. It's a really important piece of proposed legislation. The topic is hugely important. Years and years have gone by where many of us have sat on stages like this, and I know many people on the Hill and in the State Department and the Pentagon and in the White House have talked about the need for U.S. foreign policy to improve in this absolutely vital area. So I really commend these two senators for coming together across the aisle to address something we all know is a problem. You know, kudos to you. I also want to really commend the approach because one of the really important parts of the legislation is the proposed Information Access Fund. And that's a fund that Senator Portman was talking about that will actually give resources to invest not in what U.S. government is doing, but in what credible actors, credible local voices are doing in these communities around the world, whether it's counter-propaganda, whether it's counter-extremism. We just really have to come to terms with the fact that the United States government is not always the most credible voice in these debates. Period, full stop. And so what we need to do is support and invest in the people who are making the credible arguments. What I am saying is neither brain surgery nor very new, to be honest, but it's something we've really struggled as a country and as a government to be able to do. We've done it in the past, and I think we need some very agile approaches to do it in the future. The other thing I really want to commend, and Senator Murphy mentioned the focus on exchange programs and other people-to-people efforts, is that the proposed legislation is so smart because it doesn't just focus on counter-messaging, which I think is a profound mischaracterization of the problem. It also focuses on the need to invest in relationships, the need to invest in people, the need to invest in relationships, the need to invest in movements, which is going to be far more powerful over the long term than any kind of new tweet campaign or new, better crafted messaging. And we can really get wrapped up in that counter messaging and approach. And I'll turn back to that issue as I talk about my words of caution. My words of caution are, number one, don't focus too much on the messaging. For years, we've spun ourselves around trying to craft the right message. Why aren't our messages persuasive? Whether dealing with ISIS or Russia or whatever the threat of the day is. We need to focus instead on the actors that are the people who are credible, who are going to be in those societies for the long term, and what they're going to say and how they're going to say it and how they're going to continue to carry the message along in the future. I think that's a far more effective approach. And I think this legislation actually proposes to do just that. It is a more nuanced and informed approach, I think. The other thing, a word of caution, is let's not get too hung up on the bureaucracy. When I've heard of these kinds of efforts in the past, they get so wrapped up in whose box goes where and who's in charge of this and this center and that center and where we're going to place it. But far, far more important over the long run is what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, how we're going to resource it, and how we're going to sustain it over the long term. And so I just want to caution that where these efforts often founder is this sort of bureaucratic box shuffling. I don't want to totally discount the need to look inside the US government or decide who's in charge, but I just want to say sometimes that's where the conversation ends. And I'm really glad to see that this proposed legislation doesn't do that. So the last thing I'd like to say are just a couple of words of advice. The first thing is, let's experiment a little bit with digital literacy programs. The problem is not so much that there's propaganda spewing across airwaves and in media and on the web. It's the fact that it's actually having an impact. And so if we really want to have an effect, we need to understand much more why these messages are persuasive and what would be a more persuasive message. And is it just in the framing, or is it the fact that people have real issues or grievances that the messages are speaking to? And digital literacy can be one part of it if the problem is a lack of exposure to other views. But when the issue is grievances, we actually just need to find a way to address that. I'd also like to make a case for supporting independent media. Some of the initiatives here I think are to fund projects or initiatives from NGOs or other credible voices, which I think is fantastic. I really, really do. And in fact, I've proposed a similar mechanism in the past. But if we don't have long-term independent media in the countries that we're talking about, the second the United States turns its attention elsewhere, the cause is lost. And what we really need to be effective over the long term are these institutions. It's a little bit passé. Funding from USAID for these kinds of efforts has gone down, I think, 38% over the last several years. But I would really make the case for that boring old standard of supporting independent media. And by the way, also working with them to make sure they become financially sustainable. And I'm proud to say that IREX actually has done this in a number of countries. And then the last thing is just that issue of focusing on this broader issue of people, relationships. IREX also runs a Jefferson Fellows program where we invest in Tunisian young people and Pakistani young people and other similar programs. And it's those kinds of things that are an investment for the United States over the long term, and hopefully it will help to shift the dynamic. So those are my thoughts. I'm happy to comment further, but maybe that will get us started.
I certainly will. Thank you. Jeff?
Kristen, thank you. John, thank you very much. And Governor Huntsman, Senator Murphy, Senator Portman for your leadership. Let me begin by relating to you a story that I heard from one of my graduate students at Georgetown University. Mid-20s, worked in the Peace Corps teaching English in a small ethnic Russian village in East Ukraine during the 2 years in the run-up to the annexation of Crimea. Okay? He told me that during that period, the 2 years before the annexation of Crimea in this little ethnic Russian village, he played in a rock band with Russians. He tells me at that time to talk about Putin or Obama or Russia or Kyiv or anything like that was just about impossible. He says that anytime he would say to one of his fellow band players, "What's it like being an ethnic Russian in Ukraine?" they would say, I don't know, let's get a beer and play more music. Okay. He tells me now, a couple years after, it's impossible to have a conversation with the same friends in that short span of time. He says in one instance, he had a conversation with a 25, 26, 28-year-old friend of his, a young woman there, the same band, who said to him, "Why are you supporting President Obama's genocide against us?" And as he said to me, I don't know where to start after that. It's no basis for a conversation. I tell you the story because I think we know enough to know now. They do a lot, the Russian government, and it's effective. It works. What I'd like to do with my brief 4 or 5 minutes remaining is make 3 points, kind of under the adage, what do they say, our enemies are our best teachers. So let me give you 3 reflections of mine on what they do that we should think about, okay? Number 1, we talk a lot in this space about the battle of hearts and minds. I think Vladimir Putin has figured it out. Hearts first. Hearts first, hearts first, hearts first. And from that flows narratives, okay? And it's all about stories and narratives. It's narratives of a grievance. It's justice versus injustice, okay? It's civilization versus the barbarians, okay? It's the victims versus the oppressors, okay? But it's about narratives. And you know what comes last? Facts, okay? Facts are methods. They're means to an end. They're very malleable. They're just the stuff that you play with. We might think that when they cheat, when they lie, when they manipulate, when they deceive, that they go home at night and wrestle with that a little bit. No! That's all stuff in the service of objectives, okay? When people say to me, how do you understand Vladimir Putin? I think he's an authoritarian. I think he's a nationalist. I think he has imperial appetite. But the 3 most important things to understand about Vladimir Putin are KGB. Okay? And that means he comes from a culture that celebrates deception as an art and science. So we're getting into this space. He lives and breathes this space, okay? Any of us walk into a room, he's already identified our 38 weaknesses and liabilities, and he's chomping at the bit, figuring out how to use it. That's point 1. Point 2, I think the bill is extremely important. It's long overdue. It's going to help a lot, okay? How we should respond. And we have to respond in a fashion that's coordinated. We have to allocate resources, but we also have to pool them and align them and make the best use of them. And in addition, defense, that's what this is. How do we respond? What is he doing? How do we react? Defense is critical. I don't think it works without offense, okay? The lesson, That's what he plays. He doesn't stay awake at night walking the Kremlin corridors thinking, what will the Americans do next and how do I respond? He doesn't waste 1 second on that because he knows that he is in the position of setting the agenda, and he knows that we are forced then to react to the agenda. The biggest thing that we need to do, which we in this room can't, and with due respect, the senators can't do right now at this moment, is to figure out what we do want in our foreign policy. And it has to be coherent, and it has to have a vision and strategy. It has to be agenda setting. And then what you're doing with this bill will become eminently more effective and easier and more successful. Let me put it in shorthand. What does Vladimir Putin want? In my shorthand, he knows, I think we know, he wants to divide Europe, and he wants to build Russia up by cutting America down. That's it in its distilled fashion. What do we want in that part of the world? I think we need an Atlantic Council 4-day seminar to figure out if we can express what we want in that part of the world. The third point, and the last point, I think it was Napoleon who said, never interrupt your enemy when in the process of making a mistake. He is making a mistake, and I think, Senator Murphy, you alluded to this. He is making a mistake because their method is disinformation, manipulation, misguiding, lying, deceiving, okay? It won't work over the long term. It bears short-term dividends. There's no doubt about it. It's delicious, but it won't work over the long run. They are reveling in it right now. Remember, part of their game, among other things, is just to confuse, if nothing else. My word, did you see last week, we have this very brave Ukrainian pilot who is kidnapped, really, from her homeland. I mean, you can call it other things. Kidnapped from her homeland. She's been in Russian prison for 20 years. Nadia Savchenko.
2 years.
Okay. 2 years. Okay, 2 years. I meant to say 20 months, but nearly 2 years. Thank you. She's facing 23 years, sentencing next week. Okay. Last week, Secretary John Kerry releases a press release calling for her freedom, and the Russian Foreign Ministry tweets immediately thereafter, we're not really sure if this comes from Secretary Kerry. It may not be authentic. Okay. Well, John, I'm not sure a man landed on the moon. I mean, you weren't there, and I wasn't there, and no one in this office can prove it to me. Maybe we ought to mull that a little bit. They cheat. Forgive me. They cheat. They lie. They twist. They deceive. They manipulate. It won't win in the long run. It bears short-term dividends. But we cannot play that game ever, and the bill is crystal clear, crystal clear. We and the Broadcast Board of Governors, I used to be president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, we don't play that game. David Inser is here, the former head of VOA. We don't play that game. And what we do works, and it's worth every penny of time and investment. I end with this story. When I was president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, we had a service broadcasting to Uzbekistan. I went to Tashkent once. I had a meeting with a group of young people. Asked them if they listened to us. They said yes. As we were talking about the programming, they kept giggling. I didn't know why. And I finally said, well, why are you giggling? I don't understand. You're kind of making fun of me, or you think this is funny? And they said, well, we think that you are operating CIA broadcasting. I said, okay, well, I'm not. But you told me you listened to us, right? Right. And now you're telling me you think it's a CIA operation, right? They said, right. I said, well, if you think I and we are the CIA, why are you listening? And they said, well, you're independent, reliable, and it always checks out at the end. We should stick to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve.
John, thank you. And thanks to the senators for making this discussion sort of relevant to real national policy. My father was in the U.S. Information Agency, and he served in Italy in the late Marshall Plan, and after said it was the greatest experience of his life professionally. and he wrote a little summary of what made it possible to succeed for my children. And he said, more staff, more money, more technology, even some dirty tricks. Never mind, he appended to that. I want to raise a few questions about what the senators and we have in mind that may be useful in sharpening up our thinking, because I agree with almost everything that has been said, but I still think the mind has not completely come to rest. So let me raise 3 questions and then come at them very briefly. One is exactly what is the problem and how serious is it? Secondly, exactly what is it we want to get the government to do differently and how? And third, exactly how much do we want to pay for it? And I'll start with the third, since money is the test of policy in Washington. I think if you read this legislation, you will instantly compare what the senators are proposing to the Counterterrorism Center and the Counter-Proliferation Center that have been created as integrating institutions in our government to deal with big problems. They collect, what they do is actually well described by the mandate of the center in this legislation. They collect, analyze, share information as a basis for better policy. But I would note they have a lot of people. They have hundreds of people and millions of dollars. And the question is, how do we price what it is we think needs to be done? We've all been pretty hortatory here, and I'm all in favor. But in Washington, you need to know how much money you've got, and because it determines how many people you can assemble and what you can ask them to do. I think it's possible we need a lot more money. But we need to ask whether we can just fit it into existing budgets or whether it's worth taking it from what we're doing already in other areas. The need is big. The price tag is probably going to be big too. As I read the bill, it's kind of vague about the price tag. And I think a discussion that gets to, that tries to match resources to the scale of the problem would be useful. Second, exactly what is it that we want the government to do differently and how? I think for all that we are, saying our efforts today are inadequate, a lot of what the bill wants done is actually done, probably in ways that are sometimes inadequate, but still that have, broadly speaking, some of the features of integration and cooperation across government, the whole of government approach that is described here. Public affairs officers in embassies in the field write analyses that are sent back to Washington on the media environment in the host country. The economics officers explore ownership issues, particularly which foreigners are buying newspapers and television stations. VOA and RFERL reflect some of this in their broadcasting and analyses. The intelligence agencies add what they know. Embassy officials, the ambassador will act on a lot of this in public outreach, in the visits of senior officials, in efforts to engage with the host government and with civil society. There are efforts that are underway. I'll make a small plug for the National Endowment for Democracy, on whose board I sit. We do actually support independent media with grants for projects in the countries of the former Soviet Union. There's a lot of integration that's going on, and so I'd say one question is, what is it we want to do more of, and how? Are we prepared to pay for the kinds of activities that Senator Murphy and Senator Portman mentioned? Senator, I think you talked about the ambassador in Belgrade who was desperate to get more funding for some exchanges. What kind of presence do we want to have in the way of, the old USIA libraries were a famous institution of American foreign policy. Are we prepared to pay for them? Secondly, are we aware that we're sometimes, when we talk about a whole of government approach, we're talking about collecting more information in friendly countries. And a lot of friendly countries are not going to totally appreciate that. So we need to think about the way in which whole of government approach may sometimes create problems for us. We may find that the whole of government approach isn't always greater than the sum of its parts. We may sometimes find that the different arms of the U.S. government work better on their own. Lastly, let me say, on the question of what's the problem and how serious it is, I think we do need to do more in this area. The Russians are investing in this, in their activities for important reasons, and they've poured lots of money into it, the way both senators have described. But we shouldn't, I'd add two things to that. One, we shouldn't exaggerate our weaknesses. For my money, Jeff has made Putin sound too brilliant, too scary, too capable. The Russian investment in information warfare has not been able to prevent a serious deterioration of the image and reputation of its leaders across Europe. I don't care what you say about parades and billboards. I think that's true, and it's reflected in relations between Russia and most European states. Russians have taken a terrible hit in soft power in terms of the general view of the legitimacy of their policy aims. And I don't think they've been able to prevent a Europe-wide mobilization against Russian policy. So don't exaggerate our weaknesses while trying to exploit our strengths. That I think we need to do more of. Last thing I'd say is we need to understand that a lot of problems of most policy relevance actually exist outside the media realm. Here's what I mean by it. Take one example that's very controversial today, and that is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Here's a big project that the Russians have invested a lot of money in, and that is extremely divisive within the EU, between the US and European governments, within European governments, within leading European parties. I can only speculate on what it is that has led some SPD leaders in Germany to think this is comports with the, how can I put this delicately? That it advances common interests of European and transatlantic governments. I don't think these motives are admirable. But even so, it is important whether a project of this kind can be presented as commercial, credible, advancing the national interest, or whether it's seen to be shameful, corrupt, corrosive of common interests. And to get at that problem is crucial for American interests and for those of all of our allies. Better information warfare may be one tool for countering it. But you need a broad set of very traditional tools as well. Behind the scenes diplomacy, on the record public statements, aggressive aggressive pursuit of all of the modes developed over many decades of U.S. and EU cooperation for blocking initiatives of this kind that are not in our interest. Those are the key tools. What we need is to find a way to add information policy to it. And if the Murphy and Portman bill can help us to do that, I'm all for it, and we will all sing their praises for many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. 3 wonderful presentations. Generally, when I moderate, I don't like to talk much, but being a moderator, I have the opportunity to intervene when I choose. So I will do that briefly right now. I think that Kristen gave some good, detailed description of what they need to avoid for success. I think Jeff outlined the problem, at least as seen from, at least coming from Russia, although also to a little bit extend from elsewhere. And Steve made what I say is a critical point that without resources, it's not serious. And so the seriousness of the effort depends upon the resources you can put against it. I believe that the key to getting the resources is understanding the danger. And to my mind, the danger is that you have a nuclear superpower changing borders in Europe by force, that superpower is trying to undermine the unity of the EU and of NATO, and of course of the transatlantic community, and therefore we have a first-order threat. If you understand that, then you understand the need for resources. And I believe that implicit in the very excellent statements of the 2 senators was this understanding, although I think it's important to make it explicit. Point 2, if you accept that, then you understand, and this was a point that Steve made, that the response has to be across the board, not just in the information sphere, but in the information sphere too, which would justify a program that costs hundreds of millions of dollars more than we're spending right now. And point 3, for this to be successful, and this picks up upon what all of our speakers mentioned, it has to be credible among target audiences. And we know that this problem is understood, at least partly in Europe. The EU has put together some serious studies of the problem, and I believe we would have welcome partners in Brussels and also, of course, in Eastern Europe. So if we understand all those things, we have the basis for moving forward. And one final point. I agree, I fall somewhere between Jeff and Steve regarding the effectiveness of the Russian effort. I think Steve's right that in Western Europe it has largely failed. I'm talking now about the RT, the large information effort, whereas their willingness to work in the back rooms has been reasonably effective. But Jeff's right that in key segments of the world, key areas of the world, in Eastern Europe, not just in Eastern Ukraine, but in member countries of NATO, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Hungary, to a lesser extent, but also Romania, there's some real effectiveness of Kremlin programming. And in the Middle East. And just last point, the mechanism, whether it's within the U.S. State Department, whether it's a separate agency that the senators propose, will be useful not just in dealing with the Kremlin, but also a place where we need all the work we can get, all the help we can get in the Middle East, in dealing with the narrative which has sustained the jihadis. And with that, I open the floor up to questions. Right? And please identify yourself before you speak. And here comes your microphone.
Ilya Levin, formerly of the Department of State and before that U.S. Information Agency. First, I'd like to thank the two senators for the legislation and particularly for the importance that it places on people-to-people exchanges. I managed these exchanges in 7 countries, and I and my colleagues know firsthand how these exchanges transform people's thinking. As far as credibility is concerned, and this is something that Ambassador Herbst and Kirsten Lord addressed, these exchanges are extremely important because our message does not come from a U.S. bureaucrat or U.S. diplomat. It comes from a credible member of the target audience. More than that, the message is not quote-unquote propaganda. The message is their impressions of the United States. Even if, in those cases when they may not agree with all aspects of U.S. policy, that's also okay, because they're disagreeing from an informed point of view. Now, one important thing that I think Steve Sestanovich mentioned, and that's resources. The exchanges, I don't know how many people realize that, are extremely inexpensive. Say 10 years ago, one of our popular exchange programs, the International Visitors Program, cost approximately $12,000 per participant, give or take. Maybe it costs a little bit more now, but I don't think much more. A long-term program like a Fulbright fellowship cost, if I recall, about $30,000. I mean, we're not talking about millions. In other words, we can afford it. That's number one. And the second point, which is also important that nobody has addressed, is a bureaucratic problem. Very often we in Washington tend to expect and focus on end of the year report on the efficiency, on the results, quantifiable results. These programs, by their very nature, are often, well, they're effective, yes. Can they be quantified? Not always. These programs often bear fruit a month after the participant comes home, or after he or she met with an American participant in his or her home country, or a year later, or 5 years later. They're effective, yes. Quantifiable, not always. Again, thank you very much.
Kristen, you want to comment on that from exchange point of view?
I agree.
Okay.
I had to say one thing.
Please.
Once you add up the numbers for, if you're going to have enough exchangees to matter, we are talking millions. It's, you know, as people always say, a rounding error for, you know, congressional appropriations, but you still got to have it in the budget. You've got to, you know, just add 12,000 times, you know, say 5,000. If you wanted to have that many exchangees, and that's not very many.
Sure.
So we are talking real money.
Okay. Get right here.
Thank you. Jeff Trimble from the Broadcasting Board of Governors. First, just a point of information to what Steve was mentioning. Just so everyone knows, there was a figure given, it was the BBG budget, which is north of $750 million a year now. That funds 61 languages around the world. And the spend in 2016 in this particular theater, if you'd want to refer to it as that, is going to be a little bit north of probably $35 million, approaching 40. That's not enough. And it actually then gives me an opportunity to make the second point, which is to something that both Jeff and Kristen touched on, which is the importance of going on the offense, as Jeff says, and the importance of supporting indigenous media. So one thing you can do if you don't have enough resources is to partner with independent media and outlets around the world who in effect serve as force multipliers. So in fact, almost the entire growth strategy being led this year really by RFERL, to some extent VOA, is to take a step further the partnerships that they built with media outlets in Latvia and in Moldova and in Georgia and in Lithuania, all through the periphery, Ukraine of course, and to take their content and build it into a program stream. And this will allow RFERL by the beginning of April to be putting out a Russian language 6-hour daily video stream that starts with the original half-hour TV program we did and then brings in the content from the others, which is part of the asymmetric response. Because one thing the Russians really, really can't do is genuine pluralism of ideas. They can do fake pluralism to make you think there's a debate going on, but they can't do the real thing. We can do the real thing. And so that's part of an asymmetric response that gets us ahead of the Russians instead of just trying to play catch-up. This is a really great discussion, and I'd love to see Atlantic Council do a follow-up session or sessions to this to dive deeper into this topic.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
We'll take that under advisement. Okay, thank you. Any comments? All right, we have a question. Oh, for Charles there, and then here, and then over there.
Yes, Charles Davidson of the American Interest Magazine and the Hudson Institute. I just wanted to make a very specific comment about this issue of exchange students, because this is something that's been successful in the past and is quite popular. But we have a lot of students now studying in the West from Russia, China, and other emitters of propaganda, and they don't seem to be becoming ardent advocates for freedom and democracy. So is there something contextual, some change in the political context here globally that we need to be taking into account?
Anyone want to try that?
I mean, I think it's a fair point, and I think we have to be honest that if we have a student or a visitor come for a short program and then they go back into a society where they constantly, you know, for decades after, hear are awash in media reports that pull them in a different direction, if sometimes it's what I call the drop in the bucket problem, where there aren't enough of these people in the society to make a difference, it can be very hard to pick winners in exchange programs, where if you have a tiny number of people you can bring, boy, you better pick those exact right 10 people who are going to have the big influence. So sometimes there's I would say a mismatch of the scale of the problem and the size of the investment. And because we're talking so much about resources, I would like to make one point here. You know, I think just generally in foreign policy, we don't recognize that we can either have a pay a smaller amount now or pay a lot more later problem. You know, I've actually spent a fair portion of my career in the national security and the defense community, and when we don't invest in things like governance and media and reconciliation, we end up with much more expensive problems down the road. You know, I would point to Iraq as one example. I would point right now to Tunisia and Ukraine as countries that are in desperate need of strong preventive investment, and I'd make the case that there's very little the U.S. government could be investing right now that will head off much larger security investments down the line than supporting some of the kinds of things we're talking about in Ukraine and Tunisia.
Yeah. Thank you. Right here.
Hi, my name is Marcy Reese. I just returned from being ambassador to Bulgaria, and I found this discussion very interesting and definitely useful. Senator Murphy visited us, and he got to see firsthand some of the effects. Which brings me to my point, which is we haven't really discussed the question of attacking the problem itself and exposing it. That is to say, pointing out what is propaganda and what is real news and what is truth and what are lies. Jeff, you mentioned the facts are at the bottom of the heap. And really how effective is it to approach the problem in that way? So I'd like to ask the panel to address how can we do that, or should we do that, And particularly because transparency is certainly an important American value, something that we talk a lot about, like transparency of ownership of media outlets, for example. So I'm interested in your reaction.
Do we want to have, are we going to,
Sorry?
are we going to have people respond to Marcy? Or?
Yes, I was just for thanking people for after that. So,
Oh.
please, I thought you were about to speak.
Well, welcome home, Ambassador Rees. I haven't seen you in a long time. Yeah, I agree that one wants to be aggressive on this point. I'd connect it to the previous question about what the nature of our institutions is, because I think it's, you can push some of our values in a very convincing and effective way that just has a huge impact in countries where the default mode is you have no idea what the hell the government is doing, what authorities are doing, and you assume everything is explained by conspiracy. So openness is great. And I think particularly openness about media, also important. But I think it's increasingly we're a little bit more on the defensive when it comes to the character and performance of our own institutions. And I think there's less acceptance of the idea that they work better, they do produce better results for people. And I think we probably can't ignore the fact that in that competition for ideas, we're not quite as far ahead of the game as we used to be. Famous case of an exchangee is Alexander Yakovlev. Everybody knows Alexander Yakovlev, right? He was an exchange student in Colombia in 1959. 30 years later was a member of Gorbachev's Politburo and the author of the report that exposed the crimes of Stalinism and Leninism. I'm sure that in his heart of hearts, even Comrade Yakovlev understood that in the 30 years between 1959 and 1989, there was a better case to be made for, our institutions than his institutions, and it was kind of, to coin a phrase, a slam dunk. We've got a little more competition these days, and the ability to make the case that democratic institutions and even things like openness are always better. It's just harder. I don't doubt the basic case, but I think we, American, you can tell us about this, Marcy, American ambassadors don't have the same automatic acceptance of a lot of the things that we say about how our country works. Sorry for this long sermon.
That was good.
It was a good sermon. I'm going to say something to the point, one of your points in the sermon. Ambassador, good to see you. We saw each other recently at a dinner here at the Atlantic Council. 3 quick points to that. I'll say again, I'll make my case, that all that we do in the exchange and information space is going to be limited in its effect unless we're clear about what we want to do in our foreign policy. In the 1990s, we had a vision. It was Europe whole and free. We had a strategy. Expand NATO, expand the European Union. We're going to bring these countries into this zone of security and prosperity. Part 2, we turned toward the war on terror. We pivoted to Asia, and Russia stepped up its game. And now we're not clear with our allies and the world what our vision and strategy is. Unless we get that piece right, everything else is going to be limited. Second point, we have to tell.
And it's got to work.
And it's got to work.
Yeah.
We have to win. We have to be seen as winning. Okay? Okay, correct. Point 2, We have to tell our story, and Steve is absolutely right. It's a bit of a tough time to tell our story. And you know what? We got to get on with it. Okay? The fact is, 2008 happened. The fact is, getting into Iraq didn't work. The fact is, getting out of Iraq didn't work, okay? The fact is, we've got a presidential campaign right now which raises more questions than answers. You know what? We believe in democratic capitalism. We believe in self-correction. We believe it beats the hell out of authoritarianism and the suppression of civil liberties by system and culture and pride, so we got to get on with it. So by the way, if I didn't run Voice of America, if I were running Voice of America at the time and Ferguson happened and Baltimore happened, I'd say, let's get out there and do serious reporting on the fact that in the last 20 years, the African-American underclass in this country has done, middle class has done well, upper class has done well, lower class has not done well at all. And we have a myriad, a host of issues relating to economic development, access to education, access to technology, and strife and tension with local authorities and police, and we got to tell that story. By the way, why not tell the story about how the American grand jury system works? Most Americans don't know, okay? Last point. We should tell their story too. And what do I mean by that? If you think about RT, formerly Russia Today, part of the genius of RT, Russia Today, is it's not about Russia. It's about us. You know, it's all about our warts and our flaws and our blemishes and the criminality and the poverty and the gun violence and all that sort of stuff. What I would do is make a key part of our information policy about them. Charles Davidson asked a question. He said he's published with American Interest. He said he's at the Hudson Institute. He's also the founder and director of something called the Kleptocracy Initiative that looks at kleptocracy as a system and culture to keep regimes in power. Well, I think we have a story to tell, even though we're in a tough moment in the West right now. We have a story to tell. Let's also communicate honestly and reliably and independently verifiably to Russians that they have rulers now that are looting the country financially, spiritually, culturally, and we can do that in a convincing sort of way so that over time, even non-liberal Russians will wake up and say, gosh, you know, this is not a guy investing in my future.
Okay, we've got hands sprouting up like mushrooms in Brussels. And so I'm going to take three questions straight away. And first over here.
Thank you. Nelly Babayan from Transatlantic Academy and German Marshall Fund. Since we talked about exchanges, I think I have to mention that I'm one of those exchange students sponsored by IREX 13 years ago as I arrived to Bowling Green State University in Ohio. And there are actually academic studies showing a very strong correlation between Western educated leaders and the level of democracy in their countries. However, as someone who came back from the US to her own country, what was striking is that these exchanges should also be supported by capacity building and institution development in these countries. And I went on to work with IREX for 3 years on a media development project. And this leads me to one of my questions about the bill, if you can. Russian propaganda is a problem probably more in Europe and in Eastern Europe rather than in the United States, especially where we have Russian-speaking population. And the problem is not so much RT, but the Russian language channels, their own, that also anyone in Germany, for example, can watch. And the case of our Lisa is one of the big points. So I was wondering if the bill expects any cooperation with the European countries on that matter, and also with the European Union, which in September actually established their own so-called East Stratcom task force to counter Russian disinformation, and they call themselves EU Mythbusters.
Okay, thank you. And then right here's 2, then right there is 3.
Marius Laurinaitis, Center for European Policy Analysis here in DC. Thank you for this discussion. It's really timely, and I really appreciate the effort of 2 senators raising the issue. But I'm still confused when I am participating in all the discussions here in DC on the issue. I'm still confused. If we are speaking about the problem in terms of kind of soft power or hard power, or as Russians understand at least, and as far as understand Chinese, they do understand the same. Because if we speak about the problem in terms of soft power, it's a very different thing than how they understand the problem. When, let's say, American highest ranking officials of American military says that Russia poses an existential threat to United States, it seems to me that we should pay more attention and devote more resources to our defense. It's not about something like something embarrassment we face from these countries. It's a kind, in our days, in our modern world, it's just another part of military intervention. So I'm not so much concerned about, I don't believe that the goal of Russian propaganda, let's say, is to improve the image of Russia or Putin in Europe. They're doing absolutely different things. They are trying to undermine our societies. Let's say, take the example in Germany. It's not about improving the image, it's about making Germany in turmoil. So I just want the panel to comment how this problem is really perceived here in the United States.
Thank you. And third question right here.
Thank you very much. Paul Joyle, NSI. Ambassador Sestanovich brought up an interesting point about Alexander Yakovlev. But there was another member of that same Fulbright group that was at Columbia University, and that was General Oleg Kalugin, who in his book wrote that the heart and soul of the KGB is subversion. So my concern, I applaud everyone with this bill. But my concern is we are looking at information warfare in a very, very narrow sense of the term. And it has nothing to do with the sense of the term that the Soviets developed and now the Russians continue, which is the broadest context and the broadest repertoire of tools that we find under active measures, from white and black propaganda all the way through the spectrum, including assassination, like we have in the Litvinenko case, all the way through to covert action and unconventional warfare like we see in the Crimea and other places. So my concern is that, and by the way, the comment about what the Serbs said to you was very interesting, because I can remember very clearly being on Easter evening in a monastery in Georgia with the leaders of the Georgian government and being asked by a priest why NATO was attacking the Orthodox Church in Serbia. So my point is that information, the spiritual dimension of information, namely the moral dimension of information, is the heart and soul which we must address, and not get into a little thing about, I'm going to respond just to this, I'm going to respond just to that, I'm going to try to get the record straight over here, but we're not conducting the type of what I would say forward operations that are required to combat a entity that does more than have embassy officials report on who's buying media, but has an integrated approach to advance their message. And let's just say we have failed in demonizing Mr. Putin's activities in Europe. Let's say it's a failure. Then all he has to do is start carpet bombing of civilians in Syria and push 1 million people into Europe, and then threaten the European alliance, threaten Mrs. Merkel with disinformation saying that a Russian child has been kidnapped and raped, and play right into the heart and soul of our open electoral process. These are the real threats. We must take a much more active stage than giving just exchange programs, which are needed and necessary, and just media response. Thank you.
Okay. Should I summarize the three questions, or the panel's?
No, I think I got
Okay.
them. I'll answer very quickly to the three. First, on the question about what are the Europeans doing, I don't know the answer, but I want to say it's the right question. And one of the things we did that was extremely wise during the Cold War was to focus as much on pulling our allies closer as we did to countering our opponents. And that's something that I feel has been lost in the strategy these days. On the question about soft power, I'm a huge admirer of Joe Nye, and his work had a major influence on me and what I've spent my career doing. I have stopped using the phrase soft power. And the reason is because I think people mistake soft power for being soft when it's not at all. It's actually incredibly influential. But because it gets treated as a soft little thing on the side, we don't ascribe to it nearly the power and influence that it has. And then to your point, I want to pick up the point about making a strong moral case. This, too, I think, is incredibly, incredibly powerful. We undervalue it. We understate it. Jeff, I think, was right before when in talking about hearts and minds, we focus too much on the minds and not enough on the heart. And I think we also tend to forget that we're not just advocating for U.S. values. We really are advocating for universal values. And by embracing that moral position and not being afraid to speak morally, I think we'll be ever stronger. And to tie it back to the ambassador's question, we also have to recognize that the U.S. government officials alone cannot make this case effectively. Unfortunately, we are not credible voices with many of the audiences we most need to persuade. And so a key part of our strategy, which I think is included in the legislation, has to be investing in those credible voices.
I agree completely that we have to play offense. We have to play defense, but we have to play offense. Otherwise, we're playing whack-a-mole. They put things out there, and we're running around in circles trying to respond. The second thing, Mario, is to your point, of course, completely right. He's not trying to become the most popular man in Europe. He's trying to undermine European unity and weaken the transatlantic link. And he has material to work with. I mean, Europe, too, is not in a great condition right now with the refugees and the Greek bailout and what may become the coming Portuguese bailout and the UK referendum and Merkel's just losing these state elections and so forth. He has things to work with. Last point I would make, in my view, to understand the potential of the problem. You said he could just drop bombs on Syria and push more refugees into Europe to cause more turmoil there. So I was in a meeting the other day where someone said, he wouldn't do that. Okay. Do you know this story?
Wow.
Late 1960s in West Germany, in West Berlin, there was a big demonstration of students. Okay. The Shah of Iran was there going to the opera, visiting and going to the opera. Big demonstration of students. And a West German policeman put a bullet in the back of a head of a West German protester. He was a mid-20s literature student, married, wife with their first baby, and it was a big moment in West German history. It was a big catalyst to the peace movement and also to the violent left and radical left and Baader-Meinhof and so forth. Part one. Okay, remember, he'd never do that. Couldn't do that. Part two, in 2009 in Berlin, researchers working their way through the Stasi files accidentally came across a piece of information. The West Berlin policeman who put the bullet in the back of the poor literature student's head was a Stasi agent. If that had been known at the time, how would that have affected the course of West German history? So all I want to say is he's got a game with the West and with Europe. It's not about being popular. It's about undermining, and we should be very sober about the imagination that exists on that side.
John, since there was a question about the bill,
Right.
I wonder whether the Atlantic Council actually has it on the website or can do something to make it
we do have it on the website.
more readily available. You'll see in reading it that it actually talks about cooperation both with the European External Action Service, their strategic communications outfit, and with European Endowment for Democracy, and in general foresees this kind of cooperation. Yes, about offense and defense. But remember, Cold War strategy first took it as the goal to make sure that our defense was successful. And that meant making sure that we had successful societies on our side of the line. And that is crucial. And it gets to the question of whether it's a goal of Putin's to improve his image. Well, yes, of course it is. It's foolish to think it isn't, but the question is, what can he do with that goal? And the answer is create a legitimacy for himself, and this is what soft power is. And we all remember who read Joe Nye way back when. It's about getting a recognition of the legitimacy of your goals. If Putin's goals are recognized as legitimate in Europe as a whole, because he's improved his image, then he can do a lot that he otherwise can't do. So I think it's totally wrong to poo-poo the idea of this question of what his image is. It's actually an important instrument in the pursuit of his goals or in our ability to defend ourselves. Maybe put that way we can agree, or if not, let's talk about it later. But I think there's no mistaking the fact that Russians are quite conscious of what soft power is. And it's very related to basic objectives of their foreign policy.
Thank you. All right, question here. First, what did you say?
Hi, Alex Goldfarb, Litvinenko Justice Foundation in London. I would like to comment on the part of the bill which relates to funding the indigenous media. I'm afraid that as far as Russia is concerned, it's a little bit too late because indigenous media cannot really function in Russia anymore freely, especially if they get funding from the US government directly or indirectly. So some other solutions should be sought in this relation. The tool that the Russians are using to muzzle indigenous free media is, believe it or not, the Foreign Agents Act. And now there is a Foreign Agents Registration Act in this country, and it is now turning into actually a tool in fighting spies, whereas it was designed originally, as a tool of finding Nazi propaganda in this country. So I don't see why this legislation or some sort of a relation to other existing legislation couldn't be to enforce Foreign Agents Registration Act to such Russian propaganda outlets as Russia Today, for example. Their activities here fall directly under the language of the FARA. The second comment is the recently used very effective tool in this asymmetric warfare with Russia has been targeted sanctions. And there are precedents of targeted sanctions against a propaganda master in Russia, and that is the sanctioning of Mr. Dmitry Kiselyov of the Russian state channel by the European Union. Specifically, he is both a host on the TV program, very popular primetime TV program, and an executive of a Russian state channel. So the European Union sanctioned him because of his role in the propaganda backup of the events in Ukraine. I see no reason why executives, I'm not talking about journalists, but executives of the major propaganda vehicles of the Russian state propaganda machine could not be sanctions in this country, and this would have nothing to do with the First Amendment of free speech, because any analysis would tell you that banning, let's say, Mr. Mark, what's his name? Yes, Konstantin Ernst, who runs the first channel for Mr. Putin, if he is prevented from coming to this country or his assets are seized, would in any way can be construed as the suppression of free speech.
Okay, thank you. All the way in the back, and then quickly, and then one more here, then we're done.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm Mark Schleifer. I'm the Director for Europe, Eurasia, and South Asia at CIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is one of the 4 core institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy. So thank you, Ambassador Sestanovich, for the plug. Both Drs. Lord and Gedman briefly mentioned the notion of grievances. And I'd like to maybe ask one question that shifts away from the information focus for a second. You know, in some of these countries, when you travel around Eastern Europe, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, the countries of the Western Balkans, you know, there are people with very real grievances. I think there is a sense in many of these countries that, you know, democracy or the sort of fledgling attempts at forming markets have not really delivered for citizens. And some of those grievances, I think, are real, and the information war plays to that very much. So I'm curious how this new center, you know, should the funding be found and it start to function as envisioned, is going to integrate with other elements of our available tools, USAID, the NED, other institutions that are going to continue to keep the pressure on to make sure that these countries that have started down the democratic path actually succeed.
Okay, thank you. And last question over here.
Hi. I'll just try to be louder. I'm Ilya Lazovsky from Democracy Lab at Foreign Policy Magazine, and the answer to my question might be obvious, but maybe it's worth bringing up anyway, since we were talking about reacting too late and then paying a higher price later. Did we react way too late to the fact that almost the first thing Putin did when he came into power was to take over NTV? And I'm just listening to this conversation, how much easier would all of this be if there was one major Russian TV channel that was still independent? And speaking of enforcing, you know, promoting universal values, maybe the value of having an independent media is something that we should be promoting much more forcefully before it's too late, before all the media is shut down already.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to use my time, I think, to focus mostly on the question from our colleague at CIPE, because I think it's exactly the right question. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I absolutely cannot stand the focus on counter-messaging, because the focus on counter-messaging is all about crafting the right information response and failing, I think, to acknowledge the legitimate and very real grievances that real people have. And it's so important that any kind of exchange, information, media program actually recognize these very real grievances, and also that a broader strategy invest in the success of democracies and invest in the success of societies and reforms as much as use information exchange to help reinforce it. So this is why, if I had my pick of the 2 most important things that the U.S. government could be doing today for U.S. foreign policy, it would actually be to shore up Tunisia and Ukraine, because no information program in the world will have as much impact as the success of Tunisia in countering an extremist narrative and the success of Ukraine in countering an anti-Western narrative. And so if we would just focus on the investing in the success of those countries and then use exchange communications to amplify it, I think that would be the single most important thing that we could do in our foreign policy.
Thank you. Jeff?
I'll just pick up 2 things. To the issue of narratives of grievance. It's a 10-second digression. After 9/11, the President of the United States, Secretary of State, sent the Deputy Secretary of State to Islamabad for a meeting with leadership there. And the Pakistani leadership wanted to explain to the Americans how difficult and complicated and complex this would be in taking on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in that theater. And the American Deputy Secretary of State Armitage is quoted as having said, well, I'm here to tell you history starts now. Okay? The good news is we Americans have this can-do philosophy. I mean that genuinely. Okay? The bad news is foreign policy is not an engineering problem. And as your question suggested, in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, there is loads of history. I started with that example from East Ukraine, right? Well, the fact is, those people in that rock band who were manipulated by Russian propaganda, it speaks to the quality of Russian propaganda, but they're tapping into something. There's something latent there. It didn't come from nowhere, and there's stuff there that they have to work with. So the thing I would say is, in our foreign policy, I think we probably need less engineers and more anthropologists. That's point one. To your point, the colleague from foreign policy, yes, too late, too little, except he knew what he was up to, and early on he understood that he didn't care if it was a bunch of pointy-headed intellectuals reading some magazine, 800 people or something like that. But communication and television would be the masses, and that's what he cared about, and he got control of it early. He blocked out the competition internally. Jeff Trimble is here from the BBG, and also from external competition like Voice of America and BBC and Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Jeff Trimble can tell you, my great legacy as president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, was seeing one affiliate after another being closed in Russia by the health inspector and the anti-corruption police and the fire department and all these other regulators and so forth. But what would we have done in retrospect? I'm not sure, because he controls that space actually, and he was out in front. But I think your insight is right. If that were more competitive and we had a greater opportunity, it would be a different conversation.
One point on that, which is, and it falls in the category of what more could have done. The Bush administration was very late to understanding what Putin was doing. And basically, they only began to understand it around the time of the Orange Revolution, which was 4 years into the Bush, almost 4 years into the Bush administration.
Yeah.
Steve?
Yeah, in the spring of 2000, a very prominent former official of the Russian government had a meeting with Secretary Albright that I sat in on. And he said, you need to understand two things about what's happening in Russia now. One, we've elected probably the best possible president that we could have, all things considered. I think he may not agree with that statement any longer, but he said, even so, you are going to see a huge offensive against media, and in particular television. And you have to help us.
Was this before or after the Kursk? The Russian submarine?
Before.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
And we actually paid a lot of attention to the takeover of NTV. But I think what Jeff is suggesting is the stakes were just too great for him to do anything other than what he was determined to do. Two last thoughts about that, though. Because the stakes were so great for him, he has not wavered. And we had to, ask ourselves what kind of contribution we could make to maintaining some kind of media openness and pluralism in Russia. And the second thing I'd say is that for all that Putin has succeeded in maintaining control over the content of main television broadcasting in Russia, there's still enormous opportunities for Russians to get access to information that they want. And it isn't just people reading, thick journals. The internet audience for, Echo Moskvy, for example, is gigantic. And as a source of trouble potential trouble but of ongoing challenge to the legitimacy of the Russian government and policies, that is still really important. So we have to keep our eye on the ball, and we also have to see that for all his determination, Putin cannot control information space entirely or even remotely close to what he would like.
I would like to thank our panelists and our audience for a terrific discussion, and it's a tribute to them that you're here after 2 hours of programming. So thank you all very much for coming.